The rise of Cheng I Sao, pirate queen of the South China Sea. The Portuguese captain had seen his share of pirates in the South China Sea, but nothing like this. Through his spyglass, he counted not one or two ships, but dozens, their blood-red sails spreading across the horizon like an approaching storm. At their center loomed a massive junk flying the crimson banner of the Red Flag Fleet. His hands trembled as he lowered the glass. There was no point in running. Everyone from Canton to Malacca knew that outrunning Cheng I Sao's ships was like outrunning fate itself. The woman they called the grandmother of the South China Sea commanded over 300 ships and 70,000 pirates, a force larger than most countries' navies. But what the terrified captain didn't know as he ordered his crew to heave to was that this fearsome admiral had begun her career in a floating brothel on the Pearl River. Her transformation from prostitute to pirate queen would become one of history's most remarkable stories of reinvention, cunning, and raw ambition. From floating prison to pirate queen, the rise of Xi Yang. The floating brothels of Canton's Pearl River Delta were floating prisons of silk and desperation. But for a young woman named Xi Yang, they were also universities of human nature. Night after night, as wealthy merchants and corrupt officials spilled their secrets in wine-soaked whispers, she learned the true currency of empire: information. While other girls collected trinkets and empty promises, she collected leverage, the kind that would later help her build and rule a maritime empire. In 1801, she caught the eye of Cheng I, a notorious pirate commander from a long line of seafaring raiders. But their first meeting wasn't the usual transaction. Instead of requesting her services, he requested her counsel. The aging pirate had recognized something in her that others missed, a mind as sharp as any sword. Their conversation that night ranged from military strategy to trade routes, from the politics of the Qing court to the precise amount of silver needed to bribe each local official. By dawn, Cheng I had made an unprecedented offer, not as a client to a courtesan, but as a commander to a potential equal. He proposed marriage with one extraordinary condition: she would have an equal say in running his fleet. For Xi Yang, it was more than an escape. It was an opportunity for transformation. She knew the risks. Pirates' wives typically enjoyed neither long lives nor real power. But Cheng had unwittingly offered her a platform she could expand into something unprecedented. She accepted his proposal with conditions of her own, including veto power over major raids and a share of the fleet's treasury. The pirate lord, amused by her boldness, agreed. Neither the Qing emperor in his Beijing palace nor the British merchants in their counting houses could have guessed that this marriage contract, signed in a floating brothel, would soon reshape the balance of power in the South China Sea. Within months, the former prostitute had mastered the intricacies of naval warfare and commerce raiding. She brought to piracy the same calculating precision she'd applied to managing clients, but now her ambitions stretched beyond the confines of the Pearl River. She instituted reforms that transformed Chengramma's rabble of pirates into a disciplined maritime force. While her husband commanded through fear and tradition, she built a network of loyal captains who appreciated her tactical innovations and fair distribution of plunder. She introduced a revolutionary concept to their operation: sustainable piracy. Instead of simply raiding ships, she established a system of protection fees that guaranteed safe passage, turning random acts of plunder into a predictable business model that would later become the foundation of her empire. The floating brothel where she had once served now paid her protection money. The merchants who had once looked through her now bowed in her presence. But for Shi Yang, now known as Cheng I Sao, this was merely the beginning. She had not escaped one prison to build herself another. She was building something that would eclipse anything her husband, or indeed the South China Sea, had ever seen. And when Cheng Ai's mysterious death left her at a crossroads, she would prove that her greatest talents had nothing to do with being a pirate's wife, and everything to do with being a conqueror in her own right. The rise of Cheng I Sao, Pirate Queen of the South China Sea. The South China Sea became her classroom, each raid a lesson in power. While other pirate captains focused on brute force, Cheng I Sao studied the subtle arts of empire building. She learned that terror was a crude tool. Fear mixed with respect was the sharper blade. When her fleet captured merchant vessels, she introduced an innovation that would revolutionize piracy. She offered the captured crews a choice. They could join her fleet, keeping a share of their own cargo as a signing bonus, or they could face the traditional pirate's justice. It was no surprise that many of her most loyal commanders were former victims. Her husband watched with a mixture of pride and unease as she transformed their operation. Where he saw only ships to be plundered, she saw supply chains to be controlled. She mapped the complex web of trading relationships that connected Canton to Manila, Malacca to Macau. Her agents infiltrated ports across Southeast Asia, gathering intelligence on cargo manifests and sailing schedules. Soon, she could predict the movement of valuable shipments with uncanny accuracy, as if she held the strings of an invisible puppet theater. The European trading companies discovered to their horror that their carefully guarded shipping schedules had become worthless. Cheng I Sao's fleet seemed to materialize out of the morning mist precisely where the richest cargoes would pass. The British East India Company lost so many ships that they were forced to suspend trade along certain routes. But it wasn't just European vessels that paid the price. She understood that true power meant controlling everyone's access to the sea. Chinese junks, Malaysian proas, and Arab dhows all learned to fear the sight of red sails on the horizon. What truly set her apart was her grasp of psychological warfare. She turned the strict hierarchical nature of Chinese society against itself. When she captured a Mandarin official, she wouldn't ransom him immediately. Instead, she would invite him to dine with her, discussing poetry and philosophy, while her fleet plundered his district's shipping. By the time she released him, he had experienced something far more dangerous than humiliation. He had been forced to recognize her as an equal. These officials returned to their posts with a complicated mix of fear, respect, and fascination. Many became secret allies, warning her of naval patrols and helping to legitimize her growing power. Her most daring innovation came in the form of a written code of conduct that would have shocked traditional pirates. Rape was punishable by death. Theft within the fleet resulted in the loss of a hand. Senior commanders who took more than their share of plunder found themselves swiftly demoted or worse. These rules weren't just about morality, they were about creating a sustainable enterprise. A disciplined fleet could operate longer, strike faster, and inspire more loyalty than a rabble of drunk pirates ever could. While other pirate bands collapsed into internal feuds, her empire grew stronger, bound together by chains of mutual interest and iron discipline. But even as she consolidated her power, Cheng I Sao knew she was building something precarious. The Qing Dynasty wouldn't tolerate a rival maritime power forever. The European trading companies were pressing their governments for military intervention. And within her own fleet, there were those who resented taking orders from a woman, no matter how successful she had made them. She would need every lesson she had learned, every alliance she had forged, and every innovation she had created to survive what was coming. The South China Sea was about to become a battlefield, and she intended to be more than just a survivor. She intended to be its master. The rise of Cheng I Sao, from widow to maritime legend. The typhoon struck without warning. At least that was the official story of how Cheng I's flagship vanished beneath the waves in November 1807. The weather had indeed been treacherous, but rumors whispered through the fleet spoke of poison in wine cups, of perfectly timed accidents, of ambitious captains and convenient deaths. Whatever the truth, Cheng I Sao faced the defining moment of her life, not in the heat of battle, but in the tense silence that followed the news of her husband's death. Protocol demanded she step aside. Tradition insisted she fade into obscurity. Instead, she moved with the swift precision of a cutlass stroke. Before Cheng I's body was cold, she had already secured the loyalty of his adopted son, Chang Pao, a former fishing boy with natural sailing talent and unwavering devotion to her cause. She orchestrated their marriage within days, a masterpiece of political theater that satisfied traditionalists while placing real power firmly in her grasp. Chang Pao became her sword arm, leading battles with fierce courage while she directed the larger campaign from her flagship. The challenges came immediately. 3 rival pirate lords, sensing weakness, moved to carve up her territory. The first, commanding a fleet of 30 ships, found his supply lines mysteriously cut, his secret harbors revealed to Qing patrols, and his own lieutenants suddenly questioning his judgment. The second discovered that his allies had already signed protection agreements with Cheng I Sao's fleet, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. The third simply disappeared, his ships found drifting and empty, their crews having decided that joining the winning side offered better prospects than dying for the losing one. But her most brilliant stroke came in how she handled her own fleet's internal politics. Rather than demanding immediate loyalty, she offered her captains a choice: pledge allegiance to her personally and receive wealth beyond their dreams, or depart with their ships and crew after paying a substantial exit fee. It was a masterclass in the art of the golden handcuff. Those who stayed grew rich. Those who left found themselves unable to compete with her superior organization. Within months, most returned, having learned the hard way that independence was more costly than allegiance. Victory brought new problems. Her fleet had swollen to unprecedented size, requiring a complete restructuring of command. She divided her forces into 6 squadrons, each distinguished by colored flags: red, yellow, green, blue, black, and white. Each squadron specialized in different types of operations: long-range raids, coastal control, riverine warfare, intelligence gathering, merchant protection, and rapid response. This organization allowed her to project power across vast distances while maintaining tight control over her commanders. A raid on shipping in the Taiwan Strait could be coordinated with diplomatic overtures to Portuguese Macau, while simultaneously suppressing rival pirates in the Gulf of Tonkin. As spring arrived in 1808, Cheng I Sao stood at the helm of the largest private fleet Asia had ever seen. Her husband's death, rather than ending her career, had catapulted her to heights of power that even he had never imagined. The South China Sea had a new master, and she was just beginning to show what she could do with unfettered command. The widow was about to become a legend, and the greatest battles of her career still lay ahead. The rise and power of Cheng I Sao's Red Flag Fleet. The Portuguese governor of Macau stood at his fortress window, counting ships through his spyglass until he ran out of numbers. The horizon had vanished behind a forest of masts, war junks, merchant vessels, fishing boats, and swift barges, all flying the crimson banner of Cheng I Sao's red flag fleet. But what truly terrified him wasn't the size of the armada, it was its precision. Each vessel moved with purpose, maintaining perfect formation despite the chaotic currents of the Pearl River estuary. This was no mere pirate fleet. This was a navy that rivaled those of European powers. Below the waterline, Cheng I Sao's empire operated with the complexity of a living organism. Fast messenger boats darted between the squadrons like neurons firing in a vast brain, carrying coded signals and encrypted messages. Her flagship served as the central nervous system, receiving intelligence and dispatching orders across a territory larger than many European nations. The code she developed for fleet communication became so sophisticated that even when Qing naval commanders intercepted her messages, they couldn't decipher the subtle references to Chinese poetry and traditional opera that masked her tactical commands. Her supply chain was a marvel of logistics. While other pirate fleets were forced to return to port regularly, the Red Flag Fleet could remain at sea for months. She established hidden bases across the coast, each specializing in different needs. One might focus on ship repair, another on weapons manufacturing, a third on preserving food supplies. These bases were connected by a network of sympathetic fishing villages and coastal settlements, creating a shadow economy that sustained her massive force. When Chinese or European warships tried to blockade one area, her fleet simply shifted to another, drawing supplies from this invisible infrastructure. But the true genius of her operation lay in its financial structure. She transformed piracy from a crude smash-and-grab enterprise into a sophisticated protection business. Her agents in every major port offered shipping companies a simple choice: purchase one of her red passes, papers guaranteeing safe passage, or risk losing everything. The prices were carefully calculated based on cargo value and route risk, making them cheaper than the potential losses. Even the British East India Company, despite public denials, found itself quietly purchasing these passes for its smaller vessels. Her crews operated under a compensation system that would have impressed a modern Wall Street firm. Every member of the fleet, from the lowest deckhand to her top commanders, received shares in each operation's success. But she added a crucial innovation: long-term incentive payments. Pirates who showed loyalty over time saw their shares increase. Those who demonstrated special skills or brought in valuable intelligence received bonuses. She even instituted a primitive form of insurance, providing for families of crew members lost in battle. These policies created a professional force with a vested interest in the fleet's long-term success. Combat operations under her command resembled elaborate chess matches rather than simple attacks. She pioneered the use of fast scouting vessels that would track target ships for days, learning their patterns and vulnerabilities. When she finally struck, it was usually with overwhelming force precisely applied. Her raids were timed to weather patterns, trade schedules, and even her target's internal politics. She knew that a merchant ship's crew was more likely to surrender without a fight during certain Chinese holidays, or when they were returning home with full cargo holds. The Red Flag Fleet's ripples spread far beyond the South China Sea. In London, insurance rates for the China trade skyrocketed. In Beijing, Qing officials found their coastal tax revenues dramatically reduced. In trading ports across Asia, captains delayed sailings until they could confirm the fleet's location. She had created something unprecedented, a stateless maritime power that could influence the policies of nations. And as her influence grew, the inevitable response from these powers would soon test whether her sophisticated organization could survive all-out war. The rise of Cheng I Sao, from pirate to maritime empress. A salt merchant's ledger from 1809 reveals a curious entry, a payment made not to the Imperial Salt Administration, but to the Maritime Security Office of the Red Flag Fleet. The amount was substantial, but less than the official tax. More revealing was the note in the margin: guaranteed delivery, no questions asked. This single entry illuminates how Cheng I Sao transformed from pirate to shadow governor. She hadn't just created a protection racket, she had established an alternative government. Her parallel state operated in the gaps between official power. When the Qing Dynasty's salt monopoly proved too corrupt and inefficient, she offered a more reliable distribution network. When imperial customs posts demanded exorbitant bribes, her agents provided cheaper alternatives. She understood that empire wasn't built on violence alone, it was built on providing services that people needed. Soon, merchants found themselves preferring to deal with her administration than with official channels. Her routes were faster, her rates more predictable, and her word, ironically, more trustworthy. The coastal villages under her influence experienced a strange sort of prosperity. Her ships brought goods from across Asia: Japanese copper, Malaysian spices, Philippine silver. But more valuable than the goods was the information. Her network of informants and traders created a vast intelligence web that knew about market conditions, weather patterns, and political developments before anyone else. Village chiefs who aligned with her found themselves making better decisions about what to plant, when to fish, and where to trade. She developed a sophisticated diplomatic corps, staffed primarily by educated women who had few opportunities in traditional Chinese society. These agents could move freely in ports and trading houses, gathering intelligence while negotiating complex agreements. They spoke multiple languages, understood international commerce, and maintained detailed records of every transaction and relationship. European traders, who initially dismissed them as mere courtesans, found themselves outmaneuvered in negotiations they didn't even realize were taking place. In the Pearl River Delta, she established what amounted to a maritime insurance system. Ships that paid her fees received not just protection from piracy, but compensation if they were lost to natural disasters. She maintained a fleet of rescue vessels that would aid ships in distress, regardless of whether they were her clients. This humanitarian gesture was shrewd politics. It earned her the loyalty of countless sailors and the grudging respect of foreign merchants. Even ships that didn't pay her fees knew they could count on her rescue service in a crisis, creating a debt of gratitude she could later collect. Her empire's reach extended far beyond the sea. She established farming communities on isolated islands, creating secure food supplies for her fleet. These settlements became more than just supply bases. They were experiments in governance. She implemented systems of education, healthcare, and justice that were often more efficient than their imperial counterparts. Children from these communities were taught navigation, mathematics, and languages, creating a new generation of skilled mariners loyal to her cause. But perhaps her most remarkable achievement was the creation of a sophisticated banking network. Her agents began offering financial services, loans, money transfers, and investment opportunities to coastal merchants. This system operated outside official channels but was often more reliable. A merchant in Canton could deposit silver with her agents and withdraw it days later in Manila, facilitating trade while avoiding the risks of carrying precious metals at sea. The interest and fees from these transactions soon exceeded her income from traditional piracy. As 1810 approached, Cheng I Sao had become something unprecedented, a maritime empress without a throne, commanding an economic empire that operated in parallel with legitimate powers. The flags of her ships still struck terror into the hearts of those who opposed her, but for a growing number of people across the South China Sea, they had become symbols of stability and opportunity. Yet this very success would soon bring her into direct conflict with forces that could not tolerate such a challenge to their authority. The greatest test of her empire lay ahead. Cheng I Sao, the pirate who defied empires. The Battle of the Tiger's Mouth began with a deception. As the Qing fleet of 50 warships moved to blockade the narrow strait, they believed they had finally trapped the infamous Red Flag fleet. What they didn't realize was that Cheng I Sao had lured them into a trap of her own making. The morning mist cleared to reveal not just her ships ahead of them, but 2 more squadrons emerging from hidden inlets on either side. The Imperial commanders found themselves caught in the same vice-like tactics they had hoped to employ. But Cheng I Sao didn't just fight with ships. When the Portuguese sent a powerful squadron to eliminate the pirate menace in 1809, she struck at their colony's economy instead. Her agents in Macau quietly called in loans, withdrew deposits from Portuguese banks, and suspended all trading contracts simultaneously. Within weeks, the colony faced financial collapse. The Portuguese military expedition returned to port without firing a shot, recalled by desperate merchants who realized they couldn't afford to make an enemy of the woman who controlled their trade routes. The British East India Company discovered that conventional military power meant little against her asymmetric warfare. When they refused to purchase her protection passes, she didn't attack their heavy warships. Instead, she leaked their classified shipping schedules to smaller pirate fleets, causing devastating losses to the company's merchant vessels. Company directors in London found their insurance costs skyrocketing. They soon learned that the cost of defying her was far greater than the price of cooperation. Her most audacious operation targeted the Qing Dynasty's very legitimacy. During the emperor's birthday celebration, her agents spread word through coastal provinces that the imperial court had secretly recognized her authority. The rumor was false, but it was crafted to be believable, playing on the complex tributary relationships that characterized Chinese diplomacy. Local officials, uncertain of the truth and fearful of offending either power, found themselves treating her representatives with the same respect they showed imperial agents. The naval battle that followed became legendary. The Qing fleet's commander, Admiral Kuo, had studied European naval tactics and armed his ships with modern cannons. But Cheng I Sao transformed the very waters into weapons. Her ships released barrels of burning oil into the tide, creating a wall of fire that split the imperial formation. As Admiral Kuo's forces scattered to avoid the flames, her squadron struck from multiple directions. By sunset, the pride of the Imperial Navy was in ruins, and Admiral Kuo himself was being entertained as an honored guest aboard her flagship. Yet her greatest victory came not through battle, but through manipulation of her enemy's internal politics. She discovered that the Qing governor responsible for suppressing piracy was embezzling funds intended for the naval campaign. Rather than expose him, she protected his secret in exchange for information about planned operations against her fleet. The governor became an unwitting agent, his efforts to maintain his corruption inadvertently serving her strategic goals. European powers soon found themselves in an absurd position, officially condemning her as a pirate while unofficially treating her as a sovereign power. Their ships would fly false colors to avoid her attention, even as their diplomats arranged secret meetings to negotiate trade agreements. The British sent warships to hunt her while simultaneously copying her naval tactics for their own operations against Napoleonic France. As 1810 dawned, Cheng I Sao had achieved something unprecedented. She had fought the most powerful empires of her time to a standstill. But she recognized that such a position was ultimately unsustainable. The world was changing. Steam power was beginning to replace sail, and the balance of power was shifting. She would need one final masterpiece of strategy, not to win the war, but to secure victory and peace. The greatest triumph of her career would come not from defeating her enemies, but from transforming them into allies. The Pirate Queen's masterclass in negotiation. History's greatest surrender began with a letter. Written on expensive paper with perfect calligraphy, it arrived at the Qing governor's office with a proposal that seemed impossible. Cheng I Sao would lay down her arms, but not her power. The document wasn't a plea for mercy, it was a business proposition. She wasn't offering submission, but partnership. The audacity left the governor speechless. Here was the most wanted pirate in Asia, dictating terms as if she were a foreign head of state. The negotiations that followed transformed from an expected criminal proceeding into a series of high-level diplomatic meetings. She arrived at each session in a merchant ship armed only with wit and documents. Her presentations revealed an empire far more valuable intact than destroyed. Detailed records of trade routes, a network of international connections, and economic systems that had become essential to the region's prosperity. She wasn't just bargaining for her life, she was selling the Qing Dynasty on the idea that they needed her expertise. Her terms were unprecedented. She would surrender her military fleet but maintain her merchant vessels. Her crews would receive full pardons and keep their acquired wealth, with many being offered positions in the Imperial Navy. She herself would retain ownership of her legitimate businesses, from shipping to banking. Most shocking of all, she demanded and received an official appointment for her husband Chang Pao as a lieutenant in the Imperial Navy. She had essentially negotiated a corporate merger rather than a surrender. The British and Portuguese representatives who attended the later sessions found themselves outmaneuvered one final time. Hoping to block any deal that would leave her with influence, they instead discovered she had already secured their cooperation through a web of economic dependencies. Major trading houses in Macau and Hong Kong quietly informed their governments that disrupting the agreement would devastate their business interests. European objections mysteriously softened. In April 1810, the formal ceremony of submission became a celebration of transformation. The same officials who had placed bounties on her head now presented her with gifts and titles. Her pirates traded their weapons for merchant licenses and government positions. The red flags that had terrorized the seas were ceremonially lowered, only to be replaced by equally red merchant banners. To the casual observer, little had changed except the paperwork. The true brilliance of her strategy emerged in the following months. While other pirates who surrendered faded into obscurity, she expanded her influence. Her knowledge of maritime trade proved invaluable to Qing officials, struggling to manage increasing European commercial pressure. Her former intelligence network, now officially sanctioned, provided vital information about foreign activities along the coast. she had transformed from an outlaw into an indispensable advisor. Her banking operations, now legitimate, grew even more profitable. Former enemies became clients, drawn by her unparalleled understanding of regional trade. The same skills that had built her pirate empire proved equally effective in legitimate enterprise. She established new shipping routes, mediated trade disputes, and advised on maritime law, often writing regulations that secretly preserved her old systems under new names. The British East India Company officials who had once ordered her destruction now found themselves soliciting her advice on Chinese markets. Portuguese merchants discovered that compliance with official regulations was much smoother when guided by her expertise. Even the Qing court began quietly consulting her on maritime matters, recognizing that her understanding of international trade far exceeded their traditional bureaucracy. Her greatest victory wasn't in the terms of surrender, but in what came after. She had negotiated not just an end to conflict, but a beginning of a new kind of power. In the process, she wrote a new chapter in the art of negotiation, proving that true victory sometimes means redefining the game entirely. The Pirate Queen had pulled off her greatest heist, stealing legitimacy itself. Legacy of Cheng I Sao, the Dragon Lady's enduring influence. In 1844, a British naval officer visiting Canton noticed an elderly Chinese lady at the docks, carefully inspecting a merchant vessel's manifest. Local officials treated her with unusual deference. Ship captains bowed as she passed. Only later did he learn he had glimpsed Cheng I Sao, now in her 70s, still commanding respect without a single cannon or red flag in sight. The incident perfectly captured how she had transformed power itself, from the roar of battle to the whisper of influence. Her method survived in unexpected places. When the British established Hong Kong as a free port in 1841, they unconsciously adopted many of her trading practices. The system of certificates and inspections, the network of trusted agents, and even the banking methods bore striking similarities to her operations. The colonial administrators who implemented these policies would have been horrified to learn they were following a pirate's playbook. The shadow of her influence fell across the developing maritime insurance industry. The protection contracts she had pioneered evolved into standardized shipping insurance policies. Her system of compensating sailors' families for losses at sea became a model for modern maritime death benefits. Even her method of calculating risk based on cargo value and route danger formed the basis for contemporary maritime insurance assessments. The Pearl River Delta's transformation into one of the world's great trading regions owed much to foundations she had laid. The network of relationships between merchants, bankers, and ship's captains that she had cultivated continued to facilitate trade long after her departure from active management. Many of the region's prominent 19th century trading houses could trace their initial success to connections made during her reign. Perhaps her most profound legacy was in demonstrating how maritime power could transcend traditional state authority. Her empire had shown that control of trade routes could be more valuable than control of territory. This lesson wasn't lost on the British, who would later apply similar principles in building their own informal empire through trade dominance. The very concept of free trade enforced by naval power owed something to her example. Modern scholars studying her records, those that survived the deliberate obscuring of her story by embarrassed officials, discovered she had created something remarkable. A maritime enterprise that transcended simple categories of legal and illegal. Her operation had functioned as a kind of proto-multinational corporation, complete with sophisticated financial instruments, international trade networks, and complex organizational structures. The waters she once ruled have become some of the most contested in the modern world. Nations argue over shipping lanes and territorial claims in the South China Sea, while commercial vessels navigate complex regulations and regional politics. Modern pirates operating in Asian waters still study her tactics, though none have achieved anything approaching her sophistication. But her true heirs aren't the pirates. They're the corporate strategists and maritime lawyers who navigate the modern intersection of commerce, power, and international law. Her final years were spent not in hiding but in plain sight, living in a mansion overlooking the waters she had once dominated. She maintained a small but profitable shipping business, advised Chinese officials on maritime affairs, and according to some sources, quietly continued to pull strings in regional politics. When she died in 1844, the official notifications of her passing were sent not just to Chinese authorities, but to trading houses and shipping companies across Asia. Even in death, she transcended simple categorization. The greatest tribute to her legacy might be how thoroughly it was hidden. Official histories minimized her role, unable to admit that a woman, a former prostitute at that, had forced the empire to treat with her as an equal. But in the ports and shipping offices of Asia, her influence endured. The very systems of maritime trade that developed in the 19th century bore her invisible fingerprints. She had not just lived outside the rules, she had written new ones that survived long after the red flags were furled. The legacy of Cheng I Sao, a maritime pioneer. Night falls differently now in the South China Sea. Steam-powered ships cut through waters once ruled by sail, their iron hulls marking the dawn of a new era. But on this particular evening in 1844, the old world and the new converged in a singular moment. A British steamship, one of the first in these waters, dropped anchor in Victoria Harbour. Its captain, preparing to negotiate his first Hong Kong port fees, received curious instructions from his company's agent. Wait for the old woman in green silk. Her terms are final. The woman who arrived bore little resemblance to the terror of the China seas. Her silk robe spoke of merchant wealth, her manner of quiet authority. But when she spoke of trading routes and seasonal winds, the captain recognized something in her eyes, the same deep understanding of these waters that had made her legendary. It would be her last such meeting. Within weeks, Cheng I Sao would be gone, leaving behind a maritime world she had helped shape. Today, supertankers and container ships ply these same waters, carrying the lifeblood of global commerce. The channels she once controlled have become the most traveled shipping lanes on Earth. Satellite navigation has replaced the intimate knowledge of winds and currents that gave her fleet its edge. Yet in the algorithms that calculate shipping insurance rates, in the international laws governing maritime commerce, in the very way trade flows through Southeast Asia, echoes of her influence remain. In a final twist of fate, her greatest victory may have been in disappearing from official histories. While governments and empires crumbled, while wars and revolutions reshaped Asia, her practical systems for managing maritime trade quietly endured. She achieved what few in history have managed, not just success within the rules of her time, but the power to write new rules that outlived her. The lights of Hong Kong now shine where her red flags once flew. Container ports occupy the harbors where she once held court. But for those who know where to look, her story is written in the very patterns of modern maritime commerce. In an age of international corporations and global trade networks, she seems less a criminal than a pioneer, a woman who saw beyond the horizon of her time and dared to build something new. As that British captain recorded in his log that final night, met the one they still call the grandmother of the South China Sea. Found myself wondering if we merchants, with all our modern innovations, have yet to catch up to where she stood 30 years ago. These waters may never see her like again. He was right. They never have.